So we have the next panel, which is really, it's a single, I think, a single presenter and moderated by Shehara Parakrama. We are very happy to have Shehara, who is an international communication specialist and brand builder with over 30 years experience in media, marketing, strategic planning, advocacy, and competitiveness consultancy in many countries. She has also held many positions in the private, multinational, government, and development organizations. Apart from extensive experience in leading tourism Malaysia, MICE and medical tourism, and the KL Education City investment promotion strategies in Malaysia, she has played a key role in repositioning Singer in retail, Janashakti in insurance, and NDB banking in Sri Lanka. And Shehara is a member of many boards in the private sector. It's too numerous to mention, but we are very happy and honored. So there will be Shehara and one presenter on enhancing production and services, which is, as we heard Murtaza, one of the answers to get us out of this mess. So over to you, Shehara.
Thank you. We'll keep our session to a conversation and try and keep it just down to 15 minutes. So cutting to the chase, I'm glad to have Sharhan with me. Can we have his slide up, please? If there's no slide, I shall just introduce you. He's someone who is a senior investment banker. He's worked extensively out in East Asia. He's a specialist in mergers and acquisitions. He's just recently joined PCCW in Hong Kong as a director, and that's huge, a huge company that owns Hong Kong Telecom and Media. He's also the deputy chairman of Commercial Bank and many other companies. He's also worked with Credit Suisse Bank, Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan, so he has significant deal-making in the right sense, and experience in terms of how investment and how companies operate. So without further ado, I'm going to really cut to the chase and ask Sharhan a critical question that we have to try and answer. Sharhan, Sri Lanka has abjectly failed in investment strategy. Today, I think FDI contributes less than 1%, 0.06%, I think, of GDP. Countries like Malaysia would have 2 to 3%. Vietnam is something like 5 to 6%. And what we count as investment or FDI quite often is infrastructure projects where there is debt involved in it. What are we doing wrong, right? How could we drive better FDI with significant experience in investment banking and mergers and acquisitions? What would you do if you were made minister in charge of the BOI or in terms of trade and finance?
Thanks, Shehara. I think this FDI question has been a huge challenge for Sri Lanka for many years. We have had many chairmen of the Board of Investment trying to deal with this and attract a sufficient amount of FDI. The savings investment gap in Sri Lanka is clear, so the FDI is the known solution for that. We have gone some ways in being able to attract FDI. We haven't been able to get to the numbers that make a difference. So when you talk about FDI, you need three things to make it work. First thing is an enabling macro policy framework with all the other pieces that go with it, which includes energy, the factor inputs like energy cost, labor laws, etc. So that's the first one. The second one is investable ideas. So here we talked about various ideas, and We had Omar talking about petroleum resources, or one of the earlier speakers spoke about petroleum resources. We've spoken about our natural tourism resources. We've talked about graphene. We've talked about port assets. So we've talked about several of these natural assets that Sri Lanka has been gifted with. And then we also talk about certain sectors like ICT, apparel industry, which has been evolved over the time. So second point is investable ideas. So investable ideas is just not a concept. It has to be an actionable idea. So you cannot say, we have this amount of mineral resources, come and do something. It has to be an investable idea, means it has been developed to a stage where an international investor can come and invest in it. So that's the second one. So the third one is the engagement with the investor, and this is where the BOI and several public-private partnership initiatives, etc., have been set up for the engagement with the investors. So in all of these three areas, we've had, I would say, some progress, but largely insufficient progress to make it all work. So all these pieces need to come together. So if you take the first area, we've still here investor issues around repatriations, which has been addressed to some extent, but recently has re-emerged in terms of labor laws, flexibility, providing appropriate framework for employer engagement. So that has, I would say, come some ways, and it is, in a stage where maybe some further enhancement is possible. The second category, we have again made some progress, but I would say that is an area where we are sufficiently still behind. So we talk about natural resources, port resources, renewable energy resources, but we are not bringing them to an investable idea. So when I say investable idea, cement in Kankasanture, it has to be an investable idea. The investor just saying that we have some of the mineral resources is not sufficient. So development of that into an investable stage, which basically includes what are the factors that an investor will look for in terms of the logistical support, in terms of legal framework, in terms of investment framework, in terms of returns that they are looking at, the tax framework that we've touched on previously, that is an enabler. So all these things need to be put in together. Investors are typically looking for an investment return. And most international, multinational investors are not just looking to maximize profits. There are, as we can see, there are sustainability, ESG initiatives in place. So as long as there's a sufficient return on the investment, they will come. So that investable idea component needs substantial enhancement. Then the engagement, the third area. Again, that area we could do a lot more. So the global, if you look at the FDI flows globally now, where is the money going? Is the money going to Vietnam, Latin America, Mexico, parts of Eastern Europe, Romania? Why is it not coming here? So that level of understanding of what is motivating an investor to go to Vietnam and not come to Sri Lanka needs to be looked at. That's one part of it, but the reason you're looking at it is to engage with that investor in a more sophisticated manner. So Samsung, what is motivating their investment decision? Do we have the right level of engagement with the Samsung decision makers? So in that process, of course, there are a lot of interferences that don't help. But these two areas, I would say, Shahara, one in relation to developing investable ideas where we can say these are the top 5 investment options in Sri Lanka. Not just as a concept paper, but a much more advanced investable idea. And the second one is identifying the top 5 investors for each of these investable ideas and having a one-on-one level engagement with them. So if it is, if you're talking about mineral sands, we know who are the global players in mineral sands. Do we have a one-on-one engagement with them, or are we just putting up our stall and say, come to Sri Lanka, it looks beautiful, come and invest? So we have to go beyond that.
You're absolutely right. From my little experience, when I was based in Malaysia, I remember how ad hoc the way some of our investment promotion teams used to come. One of our biggest businessmen actually called me from the airport once and said, Shahara, I heard you're well placed and you know a lot of people here. Could you fix an appointment with so-and-so, one of the biggest companies? I mean, on the fly at the airport, trying to fix an appointment with no strategy about what they were going to achieve in the meeting or anything else. But we don't have much time to drill down into what an investable idea would entail in terms of an actual team of experts and the background homework that has to be done. I'm going to move on to what is another very controversial area and sadly not spoken about much in the media. Sri Lanka signed a Singapore trade agreement that Mangala Samaravira, so this was a Singapore trade agreement, I think one of the trade agreements that's very comprehensive, and it was an agreement that was masterminded by Mangala and got through cabinet in January 2018. It covered goods and services, investment, trade facilitation, intellectual property rights, and government procurement. I know Murtaza mentioned the fact that all agreements can now be welched on, but I think it's a tragedy that it was welched on the way it was. It was done mainly because I think the Chamber of Commerce and various other, I think the opposition were protesting about round tripping. Because the truth is that Singapore is an open market and 99% of all goods can go in there, I think, duty-free. So in us trying to offer 80% of all our goods over 15 years duty-free, everybody was asking, what's the deal? I know the deal was mainly for services, but would you like to discuss that in any way and comment on it?
I think, we are a trade-dependent economy. I think we all understood while we were going through the currency crisis that exports is the way out for Sri Lanka, and I think there is general consensus view that we need to have an export-driven economy. The reality of world trade is that world trade is moving into FTA-type arrangements. So at the moment, India is negotiating an FTA with the European Union. So these FTAs are getting discussed bilaterally and also with trading blocs. So having an FTA is now will become a necessity in the future. Otherwise, you will not have normal market access because the others would have FTAs and you'd be left out. So in principle, the FTAs are the way to go. Sri Lanka signed its first FTA with India in 1998. And the plan was to, as part of the national planning policy and export policy, the plan was to develop a series of FTAs and that those haven't progressed at the pace that it was envisaged. So having those FTAs are a necessity. Now the nature of each of those, and if you recall when the Indian FTA was signed, there was significant opposition to it. It was limited to a certain amount of goods. But the idea is for Sri Lanka to become more sophisticated in its negotiation of the FTAs and identify FTAs that are beneficial. Now the trade imbalance with Singapore is one of the main causes. But there are things like domestic content. Now for the Singapore FTA it's set at 35%. There are negative lists. So there are ways to structure these FTAs. So the stakeholder engagement and creating awareness of the benefits of the FTA and making sure all stakeholders, including chambers and other interested parties, have a say in developing it. So this is where I think that in Sri Lanka, just because of the nature of the style of discussion, the level of engagement with stakeholders needs to be much more. So that may be an area that can help these FTAs progress further. Now we are talking about FTAs with Thailand, etc. So the need for FTA is a must. Negotiating them smartly is up to us to make sure we have the right negotiating teams fronting those discussions, and we look at it from a long-term value additive process for Sri Lanka. But staying out of the FTA is a dangerous game to play because the other countries, our competitors, are getting into those FTAs in any case.
Well, since you brought up exports, I thought I'll quickly rush through an export question. So the argument has been that other than whatever happened with the 100 garments policy, which gave us an apparel industry, which has done relatively well, one can argue that there's been little innovation and diversification into the nearby product space, a concept that means that you when new products closely related to each other are developed. So if you're in garments, what would have been the next step? Where would we have gone with it? The fact that we never really created proper value add in the garment sector. We were just Boy Scouts, right? some Victoria's Secret or somebody like that asked us to make garments, and we made it to there. We never went and built brands really. We never went up the value chain. So it's, in my opinion, sadly a failure, because we had some extremely good companies doing well, and they never really leveraged into digitalization or anything else where we could have had competitive advantage. So what's your take on that? Where should we go? Should it be light engineering? We need employment for sure. But the old argument that, employment can mean anything. You can get a company that can dig a hole with teaspoons, or you can get a company that can dig that same hole with, I don't know, some kind of heavy machinery, or maybe can do it at the highest tech. So where is technology transfer? Malaysia did very well, I think, bringing in the car industry, Proton and Perodua, with the Japanese. What have we done, and where could we go?
Yeah, so again, this stems from a fundamental question that we all struggle with, which is, the composition of the Sri Lankan economy at a 10,000 GDP per capita level. What does it look like, right? And you have to, I think Omar spoke about a vision. You have to have a vision of where it is, and that vision is also tied to what it means. So if you have an economy that has taken off, you would assume you're looking at a 10,000 per capita GDP. We've had some setbacks in the last couple of years, but this is a journey, right? So in that, exports is a crucial part. When we post-independence from the tape-all rubber economy, what have we done to really broaden and diversify our export base? And this is the question. And one of the key initiatives that Shehara picked up was the apparel industry. So we need another engine of growth, and that engine has been what various administrations have been trying to put in place. So we have talked about light engineering, light manufacturing, because it needs to absorb our labor force and be able to pay them a good wage. So this is the actually fundamental challenge. ICT seems to be the natural way to go. But that is a multi-year plan. We talked about various international software companies coming in, but the critical mass of human talent needs to be developed, and that development can't be done over a 6-month, 12-month period. This is a multi-year period where we get our professionals licensed to do various things. So export diversification is crucial, because our current export base may struggle to support the economy at a higher per capita income level. It cannot be done. So value addition, so I would say that ultimately it boils down to looking at where is the natural strengths of Sri Lanka and playing to that. Of course, graphene and some of these natural resources, port resources, those we can play into. But the human resource aspect of it, the creativity aspect of it, how do we monetize that? And it ultimately comes down to ICT and services industry. We can do a bit more in light manufacturing. Now, one of the challenges that we see is the apparel industry. Some of the apparel exporters are going overseas for various reasons. But these trained apparel workers need to be upskilled, reskilled at a high value chain proposition. So if a large, coming back to that FDI question, if a large international player wants to come here and it says, look, I want skilled people, I want 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 skilled people, are we able to offer that? And the answer is no, except in some very limited areas, low value added areas.
Shehara?
So we need to develop towards that.
Sorry to interrupt, it's so interesting, about 1 minute more.
Okay, then maybe I'll just ask one quick question. Capital markets. We need to get more investment in there, and I know there are limitations, but a quick answer related to perhaps getting the big banks and them on into the stock exchange or anything like that?
Say that
that might be a low-hanging fruit, right?
Yes, so the capital markets, even countries like Singapore and Malaysia, they are stock exchanges. There is the stock exchange should reflect the economy firstly. So the broad sectors of the economy need to be reflected. So at the moment, if you look at our economy, the state banks, some of the other core assets like the utility assets, they are not included. So there is some room there that can be done. I would say in the last couple of years, there was some good movement with some of the smaller Empower board, the Dirisavi board, and we saw a series of IPOs. But for capital markets to be successful, it needs to have scale. So you need to have liquidity and scale. Liquidity and scale you can only get by the large companies listing and creating sufficient market liquidity for the investors to come. Otherwise, you would have a situation where the investors, there's not enough liquidity for sizable international investors to participate. So an assessment of which are the large companies not reflected in the stock market and trying to attract them to list to create a big enough scale for international investors to participate in the stock market. We have also done a good job, I think, trying to attract domestic investors, but that needs to come with a level of education so that the investors know what they are getting into in terms of investing in stocks.
I think we'll wrap there. So as a final summary, I think there's a separate summary that will go on. I think the devil is in the detail, and Sri Lanka has not been want of ideas. It is the crisis of implementation. And I hope, Richard, that wherever we go from here, that the granular detail that you spoke of and really walking the talk is what we've got to do, because there's so many talk shops. We've got to move from there. Thank you.